Tuesday morning, 6:47 a.m. My trash bin was on its side again. Third week in a row. Neighbors started peeking through blinds, whispering. I didn't yell. Street. I just smiled and picked it back up. But that Tuesday, something in her face changed. Because this time, she wasn't smiling back. My name is Rachel Doyle. Single mother of 2. Elementary school teacher. And proud new homeowner in Maple Ridge Estates. After my divorce, this small brick house on Larkspur Lane was supposed to be our fresh start. Quiet streets, good schools, a place my kids could finally feel safe. What nobody warned me about was Denise Calloway, HOA board president, self-appointed queen of Maple Ridge, who treated every cracked driveway and crooked mailbox as a personal insult against her legacy. I didn't know it yet, but my quiet cul-de-sac was about to become her battlefield, and I was the target she'd chosen first. The first sign of trouble came 2 days after I moved in. Denise appeared on my porch in a visor and pressed white capris, clipboard in hand, introducing herself as the person who keeps this neighborhood from turning into a slum. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Laminated packet titled Maple Ridge Community Standards, thick as a phone book, covering everything from grass height to the exact shade of beige allowed on shutters. I skimmed it politely and told her I'd get settled in first. That answer, apparently, was unacceptable. Within a week, a formal violation notice appeared taped to my door, citing my unkempt flower bed, which consisted of exactly 3 tulips my daughter had planted the day we moved in. I paid the small fine without complaint, chalking it up to an overzealous welcome. My neighbor Tom, mowing his lawn next door, caught my eye and shook his head slowly, like he already knew where this was headed. She does this to everyone new, Tom murmured, keeping his voice low like Denise had cameras hidden in the hedges. Especially the ones who don't kiss up right away. I laughed it off again, still believing reasonableness would win the day. Reasonableness, I would learn, meant nothing to Denise Calloway. She ran the HOA like a fiefdom, and any resident who didn't defer to her immediately became a project, someone to be corrected, controlled, or eventually removed. My second violation notice arrived for a garden gnome my son had won at a school fair. The packet apparently banned non-conforming lawn ornamentation. I stood on my porch reading it twice, wondering if I'd accidentally moved into a military base. At the next open HOA meeting, I asked, politely, whether the rules could be relaxed slightly for small personal items like a child's toy. Denise's smile tightened into something sharper. Rules exist for a reason, Rachel. Structure is what keeps property values up. A woman 2 rows behind me, older, sharp-eyed, caught my attention afterward in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Priya Nandan, a retired paralegal who'd lived in Maple Ridge for 11 years. Keep every letter she sends you, Priya warned. Every single one. I didn't fully understand the warning yet, but something about Priya's calm certainty stuck with me on the drive home. The way you remember a stranger's advice right before it turns out to matter more than anything else anyone told you. Trash day became the real flashpoint. Maple Ridge required bins to be placed curbside no earlier than 6 p.m. the night before pickup, and removed by 8 p.m. the day of. Determined never to give Denise a reason to complain. It didn't matter. Tipped over. I assumed wind. The second Tuesday, still windless, I assumed a raccoon. By the third Tuesday, trash scattered across my lawn in a straight, deliberate line. I stopped assuming anything. I started watching from my kitchen window at dawn, coffee in hand, half expecting to catch a stray dog or a delivery truck backing up carelessly. What I saw instead made my stomach drop. Denise, in her walking clothes, exercising suspiciously close to my curb. She never touched the bin while I watched, always finding some reason to bend down and tie her shoe or check her phone right beside it. But every single time she passed, the bin ended up on its side minutes later, spilling coffee grounds across my grass. I mentioned it carefully to my elderly next-door neighbor, Walt, a retired mailman who noticed everything on the block. He chuckled without much surprise. She did the same thing to the Alvarez family before they sold. Coincidence? They always say, "Sold?" I asked, and Walt's expression shifted, like he'd said more than he meant to. He waved it off, mumbling something about market conditions, and went back inside before I could press him further, leaving that word hanging strangely in the air. I filed my first complaint about the tipped bin through the HOA's official portal, attaching 2 photos as evidence. 3 days later, I received a reply, not addressing my complaint at all, but issuing me a new violation for improper trash receptacle placement. The violation claimed my bin had been 6 inches over the property line. I measured it myself with a tape measure that same afternoon. It was fine. Apparently, measured differently when she was the one holding the ruler. My daughter, 8 years old, asked me one night why the mean lady kept knocking our trash over. I told her some adults just liked being in charge of things that weren't theirs to control. She nodded like that made perfect, simple, childlike sense. What I didn't tell her was that I was starting to feel it too. That creeping, humiliating powerlessness of being watched, judged, and quietly punished by someone who'd decided, for reasons I still didn't understand, that I didn't belong here. The real spark came on a Wednesday morning when I stepped outside to find not just my bin knocked over, but my recycling scattered clear across Walt's driveway. Glass jars shattered on the pavement in a wide, ugly arc. I was still in my robe, gathering broken glass with bare hands, when Denise's SUV rolled slowly past, window down. "Might want to invest in a heavier bin," she said sweetly, not stopping, not offering to help, just smiling like she'd delivered a compliment. Something in me finally cracked. I called out, asking if she'd seen who did this. She shrugged theatrically. "No idea. Maybe karma." The word karma landed strange in my ears. Too specific, too knowing, like she was daring me to say something. I didn't. I'd, hands shaking, and did something I should have done from day one. I ordered a small weatherproof trail camera online, the kind hunters use, disguised to blend into a fence post or mailbox. 2 days later it arrived. I mounted it discreetly on the underside of my porch eave, angled toward the curb, motion activated, recording silently to a memory card. I told no one, not even Walt, still unsure whether I was overreacting. That first week, the camera caught nothing but wind, a cat, and a delivery driver dropping a package too roughly. I almost gave up on the whole idea, embarrassed at how paranoid I'd become over something as small as a trash bin. Then Tuesday came again. bin on its side, trash across the lawn, and this time I didn't clean it up right away. I went straight to my laptop and pulled the footage instead. The video was grainy but unmistakable. 6:52 a.m. Denise, in her visor and walking shoes, stopping directly beside my bin, glancing both ways like a woman checking for witnesses, then giving it one sharp, deliberate shove with her foot. I sat there staring at the screen, oddly calm, the way you feel when a suspicion finally becomes a fact. Priya's words came back to me instantly. "Keep every letter," she'd said. I realized now she meant something bigger than letters. I didn't confront Denise. Not yet. The footage in triplicate. Emailed a copy to myself and started a private folder labeled simply documentation. The same word Priya had used with such quiet, practiced precision. At the next HOA meeting, Denise stood at the podium announcing a new initiative, mandatory bin inspections, with fines for anyone whose trash attracted pests or created unsightly conditions. I realized, with a cold jolt, exactly whose bin she meant. I raised my hand and asked, calmly, how the HOA planned to determine fault when bins were knocked over by outside forces rather than resident negligence. Denise's eyes flicked to me for half a second too long before she answered smoothly. "We trust our board to use good judgment," she said. And the room nodded along, most of them too intimidated or too indifferent to question her. Only Priya, beside me, gave the faintest, knowing shake of her head. Afterward, in the parking lot, Priya finally told me more. The Alvarez family got fined into foreclosure 2 years ago. Sold their house for $30,000 under value to a company called Ridgeline Holdings. Guess who's listed as its registered agent? I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. Denise, Priya nodded once, sharp and certain. Her name's buried under her maiden name on the filing, but it's her handwriting on the paperwork. I recognize it from 11 years of board minutes. That night I couldn't sleep, replaying every violation notice, every tipped bin, every sugary sweet comment through this new, uglier lens. This wasn't neighborhood pride. This was a pattern, and I was starting to look a lot like the next Alvarez family. I began researching quietly, pulling public property records on my lunch breaks between grading spelling tests. 3 houses on our street had sold suspiciously low in the past 4 years, each one previously hit with a wave of HOA violations before listing. Each of those 3 properties, according to county records, had eventually been resold at nearly double the price within 18 months, always through the same small real estate LLC. The pieces were forming a shape I didn't want to see. I printed everything and hid it in a folder inside my filing cabinet, beneath old tax documents, suddenly aware of how paranoid that instinct felt, and how justified it might actually be, if even half of what I suspected was true. Denise, meanwhile, escalated the trash campaign like clockwork, as though testing how far she could push before I broke. I decided, watching the footage pile up night after night, that I wasn't going to break. I was going to build a case. The following month brought a new tactic. Instead of just tipping my bin, someone began leaving anonymous concern reports at HOA meetings about noise from my house. Noise that never existed, according to my actual neighbors on either side. Walt stood up unprompted at one meeting and told the board flatly that he'd never once heard anything unusual from my house. Denise thanked him for his input with a tight smile, then moved the agenda along without addressing the complaint further. I began keeping a written log alongside my camera footage, dates, times, descriptions, matched against every violation notice I received. The pattern was undeniable now. Every camera-caught incident aligned perfectly with a new, unrelated fine appearing in my mailbox days later. My ex-husband, hearing about the situation during a pickup for the kids, offered to have a word with Denise, man to woman, the way he thought might intimidate her into backing off. I told him no. Not confrontation. Denise apparently sensed she wasn't rattling me the way she expected, because her methods grew bolder. One Tuesday, she didn't just tip the bin. She opened it and scattered the contents by hand, visible clearly on camera for the first time. Watching that footage, I felt something shift from anxiety into cold clarity. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was either supremely confident no one was watching, or she genuinely believed no one in this neighborhood would ever dare challenge her. I brought the footage to Priya's kitchen table that weekend, laptop between us, and watched her expression harden as she watched Denise's foot connect with my bin in crisp, undeniable detail. "This is more than we had on the Alvarez case," she said quietly. "What do we do with it?" I asked. Priya considered a long moment, stirring her tea. "Nothing yet. Don't slip once. They slip repeatedly, bigger each time, especially once they feel untouchable. We wait for the bigger mistake." That patience felt agonizing, especially as the violation notices kept multiplying. A birdbath deemed non-standard, a doormat too colorful, a wind chime cited for noise pollution despite being audible only from my own porch, 6 feet away. Each fine was small individually, $50 here, $75 there, but they added up fast on a teacher's salary raising 2 kids alone. I started keeping a spreadsheet, watching the total climb toward a number that genuinely worried me. At school, I found myself distracted, snapping less patiently than usual at minor classroom disruptions, then feeling guilty about it that evening. My daughter noticed too, asking why I seemed grumpy about the mailbox every day after school. I promised her it would be fine, the way parents promise things they aren't entirely sure of themselves, and tucked her in early so I could go back to reviewing footage, cross-referencing dates, building something I hoped would eventually matter. Then came the letter that changed the stakes entirely, an official HOA notice stating that due to accumulated unresolved violations, my case would be referred to the community's legal counsel for potential lien proceedings against my property. A lien over a garden gnome, a wind chime, and trash bins that Denise herself had been tipping on camera for weeks. I sat at my kitchen table that night and genuinely cried for the first time since the divorce. The next morning, red-eyed but resolved, I called Priya before school. "I think it's time," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then simply replied, "Not yet, but soon. Keep documenting." Her see you scared. I took that advice literally. At the next HOA meeting, I sat in the front row, spine straight, and asked the board directly to explain the specific evidence behind each violation notice issued to my property, citing dates and inspector names. Denise, caught slightly off guard by my calm insistence, fumbled for the first time, claiming the inspector was a rotating volunteer position she personally oversaw. When I asked who currently held that role, the room went uncomfortably silent. "I do," she finally admitted, chin lifted defiantly, as though daring anyone to find that arrangement questionable. A murmur rippled through the room. Several neighbors exchanging glances I hadn't seen before. Quiet, dawning recognition that something here didn't add up. After the meeting, a man I hadn't met approached me in the parking lot, introducing himself as Marcus Webb, treasurer of the HOA board for the past year. He looked nervous, glancing back toward the clubhouse before speaking. "I've seen things with the books that don't sit right," he said quietly, voice low. "Fine money that doesn't match deposit records. I've wanted to say something for months, but Denise controls who gets renominated to the board every year. I gave him my number, careful not to push too hard, sensing a man teetering on the edge of a decision he wasn't fully ready to make. He promised to think about it and disappeared quickly into his car. That night, I added his name to my growing folder, now labeled with grim humor Maple Ridge Files, a phrase that felt increasingly less like paranoia and more like an accurate description of exactly what was unfolding around me. 2 weeks passed with unsettling quiet. No new violations. No tipped bins. Nothing. Walt warned me not to relax. "She's regrouping," he said, watching Denise's SUV cruise slower than usual past our houses each morning. "That's worse than the noise." He was right. Knock at my door on a Sunday afternoon. Not Denise, but a process server, handing me formal paperwork initiating the HOA's legal lien procedure, citing over $600 in unpaid, disputed fines. I stood on my porch holding the papers, kids playing in the yard behind me, feeling for the first time genuinely afraid this could actually cost me my home, not just my patience. I called Priya immediately, hands trembling around the phone. "This is the mistake," Priya said, voice sharpening with something almost like excitement. "She's rushing now. And rushing people leave trails. Bring me everything you have. Tomorrow. Bring the camera footage too." That night, going through months of footage systematically for the first time instead of clip by clip, I noticed something I'd missed entirely. Denise wasn't just tipping my bin on Tuesdays. She was there most mornings, walking the exact same route. Curious now, I widened my review, checking timestamps against every neighbor's trash day. The pattern was staggering. She tipped bins, at minimum, at 4 other houses over the past 3 months, always houses currently under active violation review. Every single targeted house, I realized with a chill, matched the pattern Priya had described from the Alvarez case: violations, fines, then eventual distress sales. My bin wasn't random harassment. It was step 1 of a system. I barely slept that night, torn between fear and something sharper, something closer to resolve. Whatever Denise thought she was building here, brick by brick, fine by fine, I was no longer willing to be another quiet foundation stone in it. The following week brought an unexpected lull. No violations, no tipped bins, not even a passing SUV slowing near my curb. I almost let myself believe, foolishly, that maybe the process server's visit had spooked Denise into backing off entirely. Marcus Webb called me instead, voice hushed like he was hiding in a closet. "She knows someone's asking questions," he said. "She's been going through old board files alone at night. I think she's cleaning something up before anyone looks closer." Priya wasn't surprised when I relayed this. "That's not backing off," she said. "That's covering tracks." she finishes. She suggested, carefully, that Marcus request a routine treasurer's audit, standard procedure. Nothing suspicious on paper. I spent that quiet week doing something almost mundane, organizing my documentation folder properly, time-stamped, labeled, cross-referenced, printed and digital both. The way Priya insisted any real evidence needed to survive scrutiny from lawyers or, eventually, a judge. My daughter, sensing the tension easing slightly at home, asked if the mean lady had stopped being mean. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, but that sometimes quiet moments were when grown-ups made their biggest mistakes. Walt, over the fence one afternoon, mentioned that Denise's husband had moved out 6 months earlier, something about a job transfer that never quite materialized into visits or calls. Woman's been running on something ugly since he left, Walt said flatly. I felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy at that, quickly complicated by everything I already knew. Whatever pain existed in Denise's life didn't erase the harm she was actively causing mine. But it did make the picture feel less simple. That sympathy didn't survive the following Monday, when I discovered she'd filed a formal complaint against my son for riding his bike recklessly on the sidewalk, a charge that came with a mandatory family conduct hearing before the full board. The hearing notice specifically named my 8-year-old son. Reading his name typed formally beside phrases like, pattern of disregard for community standards. Something in me went past anger into something colder, more focused, more dangerous to whoever stood in front of me. I called Priya that night, no longer asking for patience. She's coming after my kids now, I said. Priya's response was immediate and firm. Then we stop waiting for the perfect moment. We make sure the audit happens before that hearing. Marcus confirmed 2 days later that his audit request had been quietly approved, scheduled for the following week. Buried on the meeting agenda under a bland heading, routine financial review, that gave no indication of what was actually coming. Denise, according to Marcus, seemed unbothered when he mentioned it, almost dismissive, which worried Priya more than genuine panic would have. Confident people who should be scared, Priya said, are either innocent or they think they've already erased the evidence. I spent the days before that hearing preparing 2 things simultaneously: a calm, factual defense of my son's imaginary bike offense, and a fresh review of every hour of camera footage, searching for anything I might have overlooked before. The family conduct hearing took place in the same stuffy clubhouse room as every other meeting, folding chairs arranged in a loose semicircle. Denise seated at the head table like a judge presiding over her own private courtroom. She read the complaint aloud herself, describing my son's bike riding in language so exaggerated it sounded like a public safety hazard rather than a child pedaling slowly past 3 driveways on a Tuesday afternoon after school. I stayed composed, presenting timestamps from my own porch camera showing my son riding carefully, helmet on, well within the sidewalk, directly contradicting her account. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with how thin this complaint actually was. Denise pivoted smoothly, suggesting the footage could have been selectively edited, a claim so absurd for a stationary porch camera that even her allies on the board hesitated to nod along this time. Then, unexpectedly, Priya stood from the audience, requesting to speak as a longtime resident, and calmly asked the board to clarify how many family conduct hearings had been called in the community's history, and against which households specifically. The board secretary, flustered, admitted she'd need to check records, but recalled offhand that most such hearings, in her memory, had involved households later flagged for voluntary sale within the following year. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Denise cut in sharply, accusing Priya of derailing the meeting with irrelevant history. But the damage was done. Several neighbors were now quietly whispering to each other, connecting dots I'd been connecting myself for weeks. The board ultimately dismissed the complaint against my son for insufficient evidence. A small but real victory that left Denise visibly rattled for the first time I'd witnessed in person. Her composure cracking at the edges like old paint. Walking to my car afterward, a woman I didn't recognize approached me, introducing herself as Fiona, who'd lived 2 streets over until selling last year. "I heard what happened in there," she said quietly. "The same thing happened to me," Fiona explained, in careful, measured words, how a series of escalating violations had pressured her into selling faster than she wanted, at a price she'd always suspected was unfair. She'd never had proof, only a persistent, gnawing feeling something was wrong. I gave her my number too, adding her name to the growing list of people whose lives had apparently intersected with Denise Calloway's quiet, methodical campaign of manufactured pressure and convenient real estate opportunity. That night, reviewing footage again out of habit more than necessity, I noticed something new. Denise's SUV parked outside my house at nearly midnight, engine off, lights out, sitting there for almost 20 minutes before finally driving away. I texted Priya the timestamp immediately. Her reply came within minutes. "That's not a coincidence. That's someone deciding what to do next. Be careful, Rachel. Genuinely careful. This is escalating faster than I expected." The audit, scheduled for the following week, suddenly felt urgent in a way it hadn't before. Marcus confirmed the external auditor had been booked, an independent accountant with no ties to the neighborhood, specifically to avoid any accusations of bias. Denise apparently learned of the auditor's independence and requested, through official channels, to postpone the review, citing scheduling conflicts that Marcus quietly told me didn't actually exist on the calendar he'd personally checked that morning. The board, still largely deferential to Denise despite the cracks forming, granted a 2-week postponement. Marcus called me sounding genuinely worried for the first time. 2 weeks is enough time to shred a lot of paperwork, he said. I asked Priya what we should do with that gap. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "We keep watching. Whatever she does next. Someone's there to see it clearly this time." The following Tuesday, my bin tipped again for the first time in weeks, almost defiantly, as though Denise wanted me to know she hadn't actually stopped, just paused strategically while eyes were elsewhere. The camera caught it clean, same as always, but this time, something new appeared in the footage. Denise pausing afterward, pulling a folded paper from her jacket pocket, and tucking it partially beneath my welcome mat before walking briskly away toward her own house. I retrieved the paper carefully, hands shaking slightly, and unfolded it to find a handwritten note, unsigned but unmistakably in the same handwriting Priya had identified from the Alvarez file. "Sell now. Save yourself the trouble. Ridgeline pays cash." I photographed the note immediately, preserving it exactly as found, then called Priya, my voice tight with a mixture of fear and something close to triumph. "She just handed us the connection herself," I said. "In writing." Priya's reaction surprised me. Not celebration, but caution. Don't confront her yet. This is exactly the kind of evidence that disappears if she knows we have it. We bring this straight to the auditor, and possibly the police. Marcus, when I told him, went pale over the phone. Ridgeline Holdings, he repeated slowly. I've seen that name before. In an old invoice, years back, for consulting services paid out of HOA reserve funds. I never connected it until now. The pieces were assembling into something far larger than tipped trash bins, a pattern of manufactured violations, pressured sales, and a shell company apparently funded, at least partially, by the very community fund meant to protect residents like me. I barely functioned at school that week, distracted through lesson plans, replaying every detail, terrified of moving too fast and losing whatever fragile advantage we'd finally gained after months of quiet, humiliating pressure. Priya suggested involving an actual attorney now, someone outside our small circle, to formalize everything before approaching the police. She recommended a former colleague, a woman named Denise Ochoa, a coincidence of names that briefly startled us both. The attorney reviewed everything within days. Footage, notes, property records, Marcus's invoice memory, and confirmed what we'd suspected. This pattern, if proven, could constitute fraud, extortion, and potentially criminal harassment, far beyond simple HOA misconduct. She advised patience just a little longer, wanting the postponed audit to proceed as scheduled rather than raising suspicion prematurely. Let her think she's still in control, the attorney said. People like this make their biggest mistakes when they feel safest. That advice proved painfully accurate. With the audit still 2 weeks out, Denise's behavior grew bolder rather than more cautious. As though the note under my mat had been a test she believed I'd failed to notice or understand. I'd been tipped 3 times that week alone. Footage clean and undeniable each time, alongside a new violation notice claiming my excessive camera surveillance violated community privacy standards. An accusation so brazen it almost made me laugh out loud. I brought that particular notice straight to the attorney, who pointed out, calmly, that a homeowner's camera aimed at their own property was entirely legal, and that citing it as a violation only strengthened our case that Denise knew exactly what the footage showed. Fiona, the former resident, reached out again, offering to share old text messages from Denise pressuring her to accept a lowball offer years earlier. Messages she'd kept, she admitted, out of spite. Honestly, never thinking they'd matter this much. Those messages, once reviewed, matched almost word for word the phrasing on the note left under my mat. Save yourself the trouble. A phrase specific enough that the attorney called it, quietly, practically a signature. With Fiona's messages, my footage, Marcus's financial records, and the note itself, the attorney felt confident enough to draft a formal complaint, ready to file the moment the audit either confirmed or exposed whatever remained hidden in the HOA's books. The night before the audit, couldn't sleep, staring at my ceiling, wondering whether Denise had somehow sensed how close everything had come, whether she'd found a way to erase it all in these final desperate hours. At 5 a.m., unable to lie still any longer, I checked my porch camera feed on my phone out of pure restless habit, and froze at what I saw glowing faintly on the screen in the pre-dawn dark. Denise's SUV, parked again outside my house, engine running this time, headlights off, sitting motionless for nearly 10 minutes before she finally stepped out. walking slowly, deliberately toward my trash bin one more time. I watched, live, as she crouched beside it, not just tipping it this time but pulling something small and metallic from her pocket, later confirmed to be a portable magnet, apparently meant to disable the very camera she suspected but couldn't locate. What she didn't know was that I'd installed a second, smaller backup camera weeks earlier, hidden inside a fake garden rock near the mailbox. Precisely for a moment like this, a possibility Priya had insisted on preparing for. That second camera caught everything the first one might have missed. Angled differently, capturing Denise's face in sharp, unmistakable clarity as she worked, muttering to herself, unaware that her carefully planned early morning was being recorded from two directions at once. I texted Priya immediately, hands trembling with adrenaline more than fear this time. Her reply came almost instantly, "Don't go outside. Don't confront her. This is it, Rachel. This is the mistake we've been waiting for." Denise gave up on disabling the camera she could see, apparently satisfied she'd blocked whatever it captured, and drove away just before 6, unaware that her entire early morning sabotage attempt now existed in crisp, time-stamped video from an angle she never anticipated. I forwarded both clips to the attorney within the hour, who called back within minutes, voice sharp with focus. "This isn't just harassment anymore," she said. "Attempted destruction of evidence. Trespassing. Tampering. This changes everything about our timeline." The audit, still scheduled for that same week, suddenly felt like it was arriving at exactly the right moment, whether by Priya's careful patience or simple, fortunate timing that neither of us wanted to question too closely now. Marcus called that evening, voice tight with nerves. The auditor found discrepancies already in the preliminary numbers, he said. Fine payments that don't match deposits. Consulting fees to Ridgeline going back nearly 3 years. She's going to see all of it, for the first time in months. I let myself feel something close to hope, cautious and fragile, but real, the sense that whatever Denise Calloway had built so carefully, brick by brick, fine by fine, was finally starting to crack. That hope, however, made me underestimate exactly how far Denise would go once she sensed the walls closing in around her. And the next several days would prove, in escalating and increasingly reckless fashion, that I'd been right to be afraid. 2 days before the audit, my daughter's school called, informing me that someone claiming to be a family friend had attempted to pick her up early, providing my name incorrectly and triggering the school's strict verification protocol, which thankfully caught the discrepancy. Security footage from the school, reviewed at my urgent request, showed a woman matching Denise's build and walk, though her face stayed carefully turned from the camera the entire time, as though she'd studied exactly where the lenses were positioned. I called the police for the first time that day, filing an official report, hands shaking as I described everything, the trash bin, the note, the tampering, and now this, something that had crossed clearly from harassment into something far more dangerous. The officer taking my statement grew visibly more concerned as I laid out the pattern, eventually pulling in a detective who specialized in fraud cases, recognizing immediately how the Ridgeline Holdings connection tied everything into something larger than a single neighbor dispute. Denise, unaware the police were now involved, escalated further that same week, leaving an anonymous complaint with Child Protective Services alleging neglect in my household, a claim so baseless it was dismissed within a single home visit. but devastating to endure nonetheless. The CPS caseworker, kind and clearly experienced, told me privately before leaving that the complaint's specific wording matched language she'd seen before in retaliation cases tied to neighborhood disputes, and encouraged me to keep documenting everything meticulously. That night, sitting with my kids after they finally fell asleep, I allowed myself, briefly, to fully feel the exhaustion and fear I'd been suppressing for months, crying quietly at my kitchen table until Priya's late-night text pulled me back. "The audit findings are worse than we thought," Priya wrote. "Marcus just called me. There's nearly $40,000 unaccounted for over 3 years, all tracing back to fake vendor payments and inflated fine collections. She's not just petty." The scale of it staggered me. This wasn't simply one woman with a grudge against my trash bin, but a small, calculated criminal enterprise disguised as neighborhood pride, funded quietly by fines extracted from families too intimidated or exhausted to fight back. The detective assigned to my case requested copies of everything: footage, the handwritten note, Fiona's old messages, Marcus's financial records, building what he called a remarkably clean paper trail for a case that had started, almost absurdly, with a tipped trash bin. Denise, sensing something had shifted though not knowing exactly what, requested an emergency board meeting, attempting to remove Marcus from his treasurer position before the audit results could be formally presented, citing vague conflicts of interest without specifics. The board, for the first time in years, refused her request outright, several members now openly questioning why she seemed so determined to silence the one person reviewing the community's finances just days before those results were due. That refusal seemed to break something in Denise's carefully maintained composure. Neighbors reported seeing her SUV speeding erratically through the neighborhood that evening, running the stop sign at the corner of Larkspur and Birchwood without slowing down at all. Walt called me directly, worried. "She's unraveling. Rachel," he said. "People like her, when they lose control, they don't just quit. They get reckless." The next few days. "Something feels different this time. Worse." I took his warning seriously, keeping my kids inside more than usual, checking the camera feed obsessively, jumping at every unfamiliar sound outside, a vigilance that exhausted me but felt, given everything, entirely justified rather than paranoid. 2 nights later, the backup camera near the mailbox caught motion again at 2 a.m. Not Denise this time, but a figure in a dark hoodie, moving quickly, spraying something across my mailbox before hurrying back into a car parked down the block. I called the police immediately, and by morning, forensic analysis confirmed the substance was ordinary red spray paint, spelling out a single crude word across the mailbox, an act of vandalism the detective linked, through partial plate numbers, to a car registered to Denise's adult nephew. The nephew, questioned separately, quickly admitted Denise had asked him to handle a problem neighbor, though he claimed, likely truthfully, that he hadn't fully understood what she meant until he was already parked outside my house that night, paint can in hand. This new evidence, vandalism, coordination with a third party, escalating harassment, pushed the case firmly past simple financial fraud into something the detective now described as a pattern of intimidation with real potential for physical danger. The attorney recommended I request a formal restraining order immediately, separate from the criminal investigation, to create legal distance and protection while the larger fraud case continued building toward what she now believed would be actual criminal charges. Denise, informed by an HOA board member, not maliciously, simply out of habit, that the restraining order request existed, apparently realized for the first time just how much trouble she'd actually created for herself over these past several months. Her response wasn't retreat, but a strange, desperate pivot, a mass email sent to the entire HOA distribution list, painting herself as the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign led by certain residents, never naming me directly but leaving little doubt who she meant. The email backfired spectacularly. Several neighbors, including people I'd barely spoken to before, replied, all with their own quiet grievances, violations they'd always suspected were unfair, fines that never quite made sense. A collective unease finally given permission to speak aloud. Fiona forwarded her old messages to the entire list as well, publicly for the first time, and within hours, the group chat that had once been dominated by Denise's cheerful community updates became something closer to a support group for her past targets. Marcus, watching the fallout unfold, called me that evening sounding almost stunned. "I've lived here 4 years," he said. "I had no idea this many people had stories like yours. She kept us all isolated. Made everyone think they were the only one." That isolation, I realized, had been the real weapon all along, not the tipped bins or the fines themselves, but the careful way Denise had ensured no single victim ever compared notes with another, until one accidental camera caught one accidental confession of a foot against a bin. The board, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of complaints and the pending audit results, scheduled an emergency full community meeting for the following weekend, the largest turnout Maple Ridge Estates had seen in years, according to Walt's decades of observation. Denise requested to address the community first, before any audit findings were formally presented, a request the board, still cautiously deferential, granted despite growing unease among several members who'd begun quietly comparing notes of their own. I spent the days before that meeting preparing carefully with the attorney, organizing everything into a clear, chronological presentation, not to attack, she advised, but simply to lay out facts so undeniable that no amount of charm could talk around them. My kids stayed with their father that weekend, a small mercy that let me focus entirely on what was coming, though I called them each night, needing to hear their voices, needing that reminder of exactly why all of this mattered. The night before the meeting, my porch camera caught one final incident. Denise's SUV parked outside my house past midnight again, though this time she never got out, simply sitting in the dark for nearly 30 minutes before driving away without incident. I didn't know, watching that footage, whether she was planning something or simply unraveling under the pressure of everything closing in around her. But either way, it confirmed exactly how right Walt and Priya had been to keep warning me. The detective, informed of this final incident, added it to the growing case file, noting it as further evidence of obsessive fixation that would likely factor into both the criminal proceedings and my pending request for a permanent restraining order. By the morning of the meeting, everything was assembled: footage, financial records, witness statements, the handwritten note, Fiona's messages, the vandalism report, a case built not on anger or assumption, but on months of patient, careful, undeniable documentation. The community center parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Cars lining both sides of the street, Neighbors I recognized only vaguely filing in with the particular tension of people who sensed something significant was about to happen. I sat near the front this time, Priya on one side, the attorney on the other, a small folder of physical evidence in my lap even though everything had already been formally submitted, a habit born from months of needing tangible proof close at hand. Denise arrived last. As always, dressed sharper than usual, visor replaced with a blazer, clipboard replaced with prepared notes, a woman clearly intending to control the narrative before anyone else got the chance to shape it first. She opened by thanking the community for 11 years of dedicated service. Her voice steady, practiced, warm in a way that momentarily made me doubt my own certainty about everything I knew was coming next in that folder beside me. Then she pivoted, describing a small group of disgruntled residents, spreading misleading rumors, for reasons she framed vaguely as jealousy or personal vendetta, carefully avoiding any specific mention of trash bins, tipped cameras, or the note left under my mat. A murmur moved through the crowd, some nodding along out of old habit, others exchanging skeptical glances. The community clearly split between those still under Denise's spell and those who'd already heard enough scattered stories to doubt her completely. The board president, forced by procedure to allow rebuttal time, called on the auditor to present preliminary findings before opening the floor. A moment Denise clearly hadn't expected to arrive quite this directly, her composure flickering for the first time publicly. The auditor, calm and methodical, walked through the numbers without embellishment, thousands in fine revenue unaccounted for, consulting payments to Ridgeline Holdings with no documented services rendered, and financial records showing a pattern stretching back nearly 3 years. Gasps rippled through the room at the specific dollar figures. Community members doing quiet math in their heads, realizing exactly how much of their own paid fines and dues had potentially vanished into an account connected to their own board president. Denise attempted to interject, calling the findings preliminary and easily explained. But the auditor calmly noted that his office had already forwarded the complete file to the district attorney's Economic Crimes Division, a detail that visibly drained the color from her face. I watched her scan the room then, searching for allies, finding instead rows of neighbors she'd once controlled through fear and finds now looking back at her with something closer to cold, unified clarity than the deference she'd grown used to. The attorney, given the floor next, presented my case specifically, not as isolated harassment, but as one documented example within a broader pattern, careful to keep the language factual, unemotional, letting the footage and timestamps speak for themselves. The porch camera footage played on the community center's projector, silent except for gasps at certain moments, Denise's foot connecting with my bin, her hand tucking the note beneath my mat, the pre-dawn magnet attempt against the camera she couldn't fully block. Nobody in that room, not even her closest remaining allies on the board, could offer any explanation for what they were watching that didn't confirm exactly what I'd spent months trying to prove through quiet, patient, unglamorous documentation. Fiona stood next, sharing her own story publicly for the first time, voice shaking but steady, describing the pressure that had pushed her into a sale she'd never fully understood until seeing tonight just how deliberately it had been engineered. More residents began standing after that, almost spontaneously, sharing smaller stories that suddenly made sense in this new context. Fines that never matched actual violations, sudden pressure to sell, friendly advice from Denise that always seemed to arrive right before financial hardship. Marcus, visibly nervous but resolute, confirmed publicly what he'd told me privately weeks earlier. that he'd noticed the discrepancies, requested the audit, and faced quiet resistance from Denise at every step of the process once she realized what he'd found. Denise, cornered now from every direction, attempted one final pivot, her voice sharpening into something closer to genuine desperation. "Everything I've done has been for this community," she insisted. "Property values. Someone has to hold this line." A voice from the back of the room, one I didn't recognize, called out flatly, "You held the line straight into your own bank account." A ripple of uneasy, uncertain laughter moved through the crowd, the tension finally beginning to crack. The board president, visibly overwhelmed by the scale of what was unfolding, called for an immediate vote to suspend Denise from her position pending full investigation, a motion that passed with something close to unanimous support. Only 2 hesitant abstentions. Denise stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the raised hands around her, the same neighbors who'd once deferred to her every ruling now voting, decisively, to strip away the authority she'd spent over a decade carefully accumulating. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, though the words carried none of their old weight anymore, landing flat and hollow in a room that had already, visibly, stopped being afraid of her somewhere in the last 20 minutes. She gathered her notes with shaking hands and walked out through a side door rather than the main aisle, avoiding the eyes of neighbors she'd fined, threatened, and manipulated for years, finally understanding, perhaps, how thoroughly the room had turned. The meeting continued without her, the board formally accepting the audit findings and confirming that all relevant documentation, including my footage and the attorney's file, would be forwarded in full to both the district attorney and county law enforcement. I sat in stunned quiet as neighbor after neighbor approached afterward, some apologizing for staying silent too long themselves, others simply thanking me for finally giving them the courage to speak up about things they'd endured for years alone. Walt found me last, patting my shoulder with the same steady calm he'd offered from the very beginning. "Took a trash bin to bring down an empire," he said, shaking his head with something between disbelief and quiet satisfaction. Priya hugged me tightly, something she'd never done in all our months of careful, methodical planning. "You did the hard part," she said, staying patient long enough for her to make her own mistakes. "That's harder than it looks." Driving home that night, past my quiet, empty curb where a hidden camera still sat watching, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. Not full relief yet, but the first real breath of it. The peace didn't last. The detective called with urgent news. Denise, apparently panicking as the investigation accelerated, had attempted to access the HOA's financial server remotely overnight, triggering an automatic security alert Marcus had quietly installed weeks earlier. Security footage from the community center, where the server room was located, showed Denise using a spare key she still technically possessed, working at nearly 3 a.m. to delete files the auditor had already backed up in triplicate elsewhere. This attempted destruction of evidence, combined with everything already gathered, pushed the district attorney's office to act faster than anyone expected. A warrant was issued that same week for Denise's arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and evidence tampering. I learned about the arrest not from the news, but from Walt, who called me practically breathless, having watched from his porch as 2 patrol cars pulled slowly into Denise's driveway on an otherwise ordinary Thursday afternoon. I didn't go outside to watch. though every instinct told me to. Instead, I stood at my kitchen window, the same window where I'd once watched her tip my bin week after week, and felt the strange, quiet weight of an ending finally arriving. The neighborhood group chat, once dominated by Denise's cheerful reminders about lawn heights and mailbox colors, exploded within minutes of the news spreading, a mixture of shock, vindication, and in some cases, guilt for having doubted the earliest complaints against her. Fiona texted me a single line that night. "We should have talked to each other years ago." I agreed completely, though I understood now exactly why Denise had worked so hard to keep every one of us isolated from each other's stories. The following days brought a flood of local news attention. Reporters drawn to the unusual details, a suburban HOA president, embezzlement, a Ridgeline Holdings shell company, and at the center of it all, a story that had begun with something as small as a knocked-over trash bin. One reporter, doing background research, uncovered something none of us had known. Denise herself had lost her previous home years earlier under strikingly similar circumstances, aggressive fines from a different HOA president eventually forcing a distressed sale of her own. That detail complicated things in a way I hadn't expected. A small, uncomfortable twist revealing that Denise hadn't simply invented cruelty from nothing, but had apparently learned it, absorbed it, and eventually turned it into a weapon against people just like her former self. It didn't excuse what she'd done to me, to Fiona, to the Alvarez family, to whoever else Ridgeline Holdings had quietly profited from over the years. But it added a strange, sad shading to a story I'd only ever seen in black and white before. Priya, when I mentioned this new detail, nodded slowly. "Hurt people don't automatically become dangerous," she said. "But some choose to. Same as anyone." She just kept choosing the same ugly answer, over and over, for years. The investigation widened over the following weeks, uncovering Ridgeline Holdings' full history, 6 properties acquired across 2 different HOA communities under Denise's influence, each following the same careful pattern of manufactured violations and pressured, undervalued sales. Marcus, cooperating fully with investigators, was cleared of any wrongdoing himself. His early questions and eventual audit request credited as the financial thread that had first started unraveling the larger scheme, long before my trash bin footage sealed it completely. The board, restructured quickly under new interim leadership, voted to reverse the lien proceedings against my property entirely, along with every fine I'd received since moving in, acknowledging formally that none had ever met legitimate documentation standards to begin with. My daughter, still too young to fully understand embezzlement or shell companies, simply knew that the mean lady was gone now, and that our trash bin, standing upright every single Tuesday since, somehow felt like proof the world could occasionally be fair. I finally told my son the full story one evening, the parts he could understand, that someone had been unkind to our family for reasons that had nothing to do with us, and that staying calm and gathering proof had mattered more than getting angry. He asked, with the blunt honesty only children manage, whether the hidden camera counted as spying. I told him it counted as protecting our family, and that sometimes the quietest tools were the ones that ended up mattering most in the end. Fiona and Priya both became genuine friends over those following weeks. An unexpected outcome of everything. The 3 of us meeting occasionally for coffee, still slightly amazed at how a shared trauma had somehow built something warmer in its aftermath. Denise, out on bail awaiting trial, was legally barred from entering Maple Ridge Estates under the terms of both the restraining order and the criminal case. A restriction that meant, for the first time in over a decade, her SUV never appeared on our street again. I still checked the camera feed occasionally out of habit. Watching empty, ordinary mornings, bins standing upright, sunlight on quiet lawns, nothing dramatic happening at all. A normalcy that felt almost disorienting after so many months of tension. Walt, true to form, kept a running tally of peaceful Tuesdays, announcing each one to me over the fence with visible satisfaction, as though personally keeping score in a contest none of us had ever officially agreed to enter. The district attorney's office, building toward trial, requested my full cooperation as a key witness, given the strength and clarity of my documentation compared to some of the older, harder to verify cases from years earlier in the Alvarez situation. I agreed without hesitation, understanding now, in a way I hadn't fully grasped at the start, that my quiet decision to install one small camera had ended up mattering to far more people than just myself and my 2 children. The Alvarez family, tracked down through the investigation, reached out to thank me directly, still processing the news that their old foreclosure and undervalued sale hadn't been simple bad luck, but part of a deliberate, calculated pattern all along. Preparing for trial testimony over the following weeks, I found myself, oddly, grateful for every tedious hour I'd once spent organizing footage and timestamps, that meticulous habit now forming the backbone of a case strong enough to leave little room for doubt. The attorney warned me trial dates could shift for months, sometimes years, and that patience would still be required even now. A warning I accepted more easily than I would have back when this all began with nothing but a tipped-over bin. Life on Larkspur Lane, meanwhile, settled into something I hadn't experienced since moving in. Genuine, unremarkable normalcy. Trash collected without incident. Neighbors who waved instead of watching from behind blinds. A community slowly remembering what it felt like before fear ran it. I still thought sometimes about that first quiet decision to order a camera. Unsure at the time whether I was being reasonable or paranoid. Never imagining it would eventually help unravel something as large and damaging as what Denise had built. The board scheduled elections for a permanent new president, and several neighbors, half joking, half serious, suggested my name for the position. I declined immediately, laughing for what felt like the first genuinely easy laugh in months. I've had enough of HOA politics for a lifetime. Instead, the community elected Priya, whose steady patience and quiet insistence on documentation had, everyone agreed, been the real backbone behind uncovering everything that happened. She accepted reluctantly, promising immediately to cut the community standards packet down to 2 pages. That promise alone earned her a small round of applause at her first meeting. A moment of genuine, easy laughter that felt like the community exhaling collectively after years of tension none of them had fully realized they'd been carrying. Months later, Denise's trial finally began, and I sat in the courtroom gallery beside Priya, Fiona, and Marcus, watching prosecutors lay out the case methodically, my own footage playing again on a much larger screen than the community center's projector. Seeing it there, in a formal courtroom, framed by legal terminology and sworn testimony, I felt oddly disconnected from the woman in the video, as though watching a stranger's ordinary Tuesday morning rather than reliving my own months of quiet fear. 2:37. Denise, seated at the defense table, looked smaller somehow than she had at any HOA meeting. the visor and clipboard replaced with a gray blazer, and a lawyer who spent most of his time attempting, unsuccessfully, to characterize the evidence as circumstantial. My testimony took less than an hour. Walking through the footage, the timeline, the note found beneath my mat, answering questions calmly, the way Priya had coached me weeks earlier. Just tell the truth clearly. The evidence does the rest. The prosecutor, during closing arguments, returned repeatedly to a single detail that seemed to capture the jury's attention every time it was mentioned. A hidden camera, disguised as a garden rock, quietly recording the exact moment a scheme years in the making finally slipped. The jury deliberated for less than a day, returning with guilty verdicts on all major charges: embezzlement, fraud, evidence tampering, and, tied specifically to the vandalism incident, conspiracy to commit criminal mischief involving her nephew's late-night visit to my mailbox. Denise showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read, staring straight ahead, the same forced composure I remembered from a dozen HOA meetings, though this time it did nothing to change what was happening around her. Sentencing came several weeks later, restitution to every affected homeowner, including the Alvarez family and Fiona, alongside several years of prison time, a number that felt, to me, less important than the simple fact that it had finally, undeniably, ended. I didn't feel triumphant watching her led out of the courtroom, mostly just tired, in the particular way that comes after carrying something heavy for far longer than anyone should have to, finally allowed to set it down completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked for a statement, and I kept it brief, the way the attorney had suggested. I just wanted my kids to feel safe in our own yard, I said. Everything else followed from that. That quote ran in 3 local papers, and for a strange few days I became, briefly, the person people recognized in the grocery store, nodding with quiet respect rather than the wary curiosity I'd grown used to during the worst months. Restitution payments began arriving slowly over the following months, covering the fraudulent fines, the legal fees, even a modest amount for what the court termed documented emotional distress. Money that never felt like it fully balanced what we'd all endured. I used part of mine, deliberately, to buy my daughter a proper garden gnome, sturdy and a little ridiculous, placing it front and center in my flower bed, where the original had once earned my very first violation notice, months earlier. Walt noticed it immediately, laughing loud enough that 2 doors down heard him. "Bold move," he called out. "Very bold." I told him some rules were worth breaking on principle alone, especially the ones that never should have existed in the first place. Marcus stayed on as treasurer under the new board, finally free to run the community's finances transparently, publishing monthly reports that residents actually read now. A small but meaningful shift from years of quiet, unquestioned deference to a single controlling voice. Priya's tenure as president became, by every measure, refreshingly boring, fair violation processes, actual appeals systems, fines that matched real infractions rather than personal vendettas. Exactly the kind of quiet normalcy none of us had realized we'd been missing. Fiona eventually moved back into the neighborhood, purchasing a small house 2 streets from mine, joking that she wanted to reclaim the ground, a sentiment I understood completely, having felt something similar every single ordinary Tuesday since the trial ended. I kept the hidden garden rock camera in place long after everything settled, not out of fear anymore, but as a strange, quiet reminder of exactly how much one small, patient decision had ended up changing for an entire community. Life on Larkspur Lane, a full year later, looked almost unrecognizable compared to those first anxious months. Trash collected calmly every Tuesday. Neighbors chatting easily at the mailbox. My kids riding bikes on the sidewalk without a single complaint filed against them. The Alvarez family, using their restitution, moved into a new home 2 towns over, sending me a photo of their daughter's first day in a yard finally. Genuinely, entirely her own, free from anyone's foot ever touching what belonged to them again. I still teach at the same elementary school, though my classroom feels lighter somehow these days. The quiet exhaustion of that year finally, fully behind me, replaced by the ordinary, welcome busyness of spelling tests and playground disputes instead. Priya, Fiona, and I still meet for coffee most weekends. The conversation rarely returning to Denise anymore. Mostly just 3 women who found each other through something painful and built something steadier and better out of it afterward. Sometimes new neighbors move onto Larkspur Lane, and I find myself the one offering quiet, practical advice now, not about lawn heights or mailbox colors, but about documentation, about patience, about trusting a small, careful instinct when something feels wrong. On a quiet Tuesday morning not long ago, I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee, watching sunlight hit an upright, undisturbed trash bin at the curb, and felt, finally, the full and simple ordinariness of a neighborhood that worked the way it should. My daughter, older now, asked recently if I'd keep the hidden camera forever. I told her probably not forever, but for now, stayed a small, quiet reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest, most unlikely surprise, because sometimes all it takes to bring down an empire built on fear is one patient homeowner, one hidden camera, and one overconfident foot landing exactly where it never should have stepped. The END.